Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture on access to land and social equity. Land is a critical resource shaping economic stability, social equity, and ecological sustainability in India. Its significance extends beyond ownership, influencing livelihoods, social identity, and access to opportunities. This lecture examines the multifaceted concept of access to land, highlighting the systemic patterns of marginalization and land loss faced by various groups, the impact of land reforms, and potential pathways for inclusive change. By addressing the complexities of land distribution and its broader implications, we aim to uncover how equitable access can foster economic and social justice. A central question frames this exploration. How does access to land shape livelihoods, identity, and equity? What does access to land mean? Access to land refers to the ability to use, control, and benefit from land for various purposes, including livelihood, shelter, farming, and cultural practices. This concept encompasses formal ownership, tenancy arrangements, and customary rights, enabling individuals and communities to derive economic, social, and cultural value from land. Let's understand the significance of it. Land is more than a physical asset. It is the foundation for food security, enabling the cultivation of crops, livestock rearing, and sustenance of livelihoods. It serves as a critical determinant of social status, providing individuals and communities with identity and belonging. Economically, land acts as a collateral for credit, offering a safety net against financial and natural adversities. It supports entrepreneurship, agricultural productivity, and income generation, thereby strengthening economic resilience. Equitable access to land plays a crucial role in breaking cycles of intergenerational poverty. By providing secure livelihoods and enabling wealth transfer across generations, land access contributes to long term stability development. Addressing inequalities in land access is vital for fostering social justice, economic equity, and environmental sustainability. Extent of landlessness: over 50% of rural households in India are landless or own less than 0.01 hectares of land, reflecting widespread inequity. Among scheduled castes, landlessness exceeds 60%, underlining entrenched social and economic disparities. The average farm size in India has reduced drastically from 2.28 hectares in 1970 to 71 to 1.08 hectares in 2015 to 16. This increasing fragmentation exacerbates the vulnerability of smallholders, limiting their agricultural productivity and economic viability. Access to commons is about pastoralists and tribal communities and rural poor who are disproportionately affected by shrinking access to common grazing lands and forests. Privatization and urban expansion further restrict these essential resources, eroding traditional livelihoods and increasing dependency. Now let's understand the types of access to land. The first is ownership. Ownership of land provides individuals and communities with legal control and ability to fully benefit from its use. This is often regarded as most secure form of access. However, in India, land ownership is highly concentrated among dominant castes and affluent classes, reinforcing structural inequities. A 2015 survey revealed that nearly 10% of the households own over 50% of the agricultural land, while the bottom 50% own less than 10%, illustrating the stark disparities. Ownership rights are essential for accessing credit, securing livelihoods, and fostering social mobility. But these benefits are unevenly distributed. The second part is tenancy, and tenancy refers to renting or leasing land for cultivation. In India, informal tenancy arrangements dominate, often leaving tenants vulnerable to exploitation. Tenants typically lack legal protections, making them susceptible to sudden evictions or unfavorable terms. Tenancy reforms, like the abolition of intermediaries, sought to protect tenant farmers, but weak enforcement has left many tenants without formal recognition. Estimates suggest that 40% of the agricultural workers are tenant farmers, yet most operate under informal agreements, limiting their access to subsidies and credit. The third is the farming rights, which includes arrangements like sharecropping and seasonal farming. Sharecroppers cultivate land in exchange for a share of the produce, but such arrangements often lack security and are exploitative. Seasonal farming agreements provide access to land for limited periods, typically under conditions unfavorable to the cultivators. These rights are common among marginal farmers and landless workers, yet their transient nature perpetuates economic insecurity. The fourth is the grazing rights. Grazing lands, historically communal resources, are critically for pastoralists and rural communities. However, access to grazing lands is rapidly shrinking due to privatization, urbanization, and changing land use policies. Studies show that more than 20% of India's total land area, traditionally classified as common, is now inaccessible to communities who depend on it. This has forced many pastoralists to migrate or abandon traditional livelihood, intensifying rural distress. The fifth category is customary rights. The customary land rights, particularly significant for tribal communities, stem from traditional practices rather than formal legal ownership. These rights often include access to forest, water resources, and common lands. Despite the Forest Rights Act of 2006, which recognizes the rights of tribal and forest dwelling communities, implementation has been uneven, with many claims rejected. Over 1.9 million claims for customary land rights under the FRA remain unresolved, reflecting systemic gaps in recognizing and enforcing these rights. Access to land in India is stratified by socioeconomic class, caste, and geography. While ownership is considered the gold standard of land access, tenancy, farming, grazing, and customary rights are equally vital for marginalized groups. However, structural inequalities, weak legal enforcement, and shifting land use policies undermine these forms of access, perpetuating vulnerabilities. Strengthening legal protections, formalizing tenancy arrangements, and preserving common ethical steps to ensure equitable access to land for all. Now, let's understand socially marginalized identities and access to land. The first category would be scheduled castes, who represent the largest share of landless agricultural laborers in India, highlighting systemic inequities in land access. Historically, excluded from land ownership, scheduled caste people are disproportionately dependent on insecure forms of tenancy or low paying wage labor. This lack of access perpetuates their economic and social vulnerability, limiting opportunity or upward mobility. The second criteria of people would be scheduled tribes, who rely heavily on customary rights to forests and common lands for their livelihoods. However, these rights are increasingly threatened by industrial projects, mining operations, and conservation policies. Despite the Forest Rights Act of 2006, which aims to protect their access to forest resources, implementation remains inconsistent, leaving many tribal communities at risk of displacement and economic marginalization. The third category of vulnerable people would be women. Women face significant barriers to land ownership despite legal protections like Hindu Succession Amendment Act of 2005, which grants equal inheritance rights. Women own less than 15% of the agricultural land, reflecting persistent cultural and institutional challenges. Land ownership is critical for improving women's economic independence, access to credit, and household decision making power. But deeply rooted societal norms continue to hinder progress. Other marginalized groups like pastoralists, fisher folks, nomadic communities encounter growing challenges to securing land access due to the privatization of commons and shrinking grazing lands. Declining access to these shared resources disrupts traditional livelihoods, increasing economic instability and forcing many to migrate. Access to land remains deeply inequitable for marginalized groups in India, reinforcing cycles of poverty and exclusion. Addressing these disparities through targeted policies and stronger legal enforcement is essential to achieving social equity. Let's go to land reforms and their impact. Talking about a historical overview, post independence, land reforms in India aim to abolish feudal intermediaries and redistribute land to ensure equitable access. These reforms included measures like the abolition of the zamindari system, imposition of land ceilings, and tenancy reforms to transfer land to the tillers. While the intent was to promote social justice and economic equity, the implementation faced significant challenges, resulting in limited success. Political resistance, loopholes in legislation, and inadequate enforcement diluted the reform's effectiveness. National level impact land ceiling laws designed to redistribute surplus land among the landless were poorly enforced. Many landowners circumvented these laws through fraudulent land transfers and benami holdings. As a result, the redistribution efforts largely bypassed marginalized groups like scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and women, instead of benefiting upper caste and affluent landowners. The unequal implementation of reforms perpetuated existing inequalities, leaving large sections of rural India landless or with insufficient access to agricultural land. While land reforms were a significant step toward addressing historical injustice, their limited impact highlights the need for stronger enforcement mechanisms and targeted interventions to ensure marginalized communities benefit equitably. Now, let's review some case studies. Talking about some good practices, Odisha's women centric policies, which allocated 40% of land titles to women, have been instrumental in improving household security. By granting women legal control over land, the policy has strengthened their economic independence, reduced vulnerability to poverty, and enhanced their decision making power within families. Despite progress, cultural norms and patriarchal structures still limit women's effective control over land in many cases, requiring complementary awareness campaigns and support mechanisms. The Operation Barga initiative legally recognized sharecroppers, providing them with security from eviction and a guaranteed share of the harvest. This reform not only improved agricultural productivity but also increased income stability for tenant farmers. It is considered one of the most successful tenancy reforms in India. The program empowered tenant farmers and demonstrated that the potential of rights based approaches to rural government. However, its benefits were largely confined to specific regions. The program empowered tenant farmers and demonstrated the potential of rights based approaches to rural development. However, its benefits were largely confined to specific regions, and a lack of follow up measures limited its broader impact. So, what are the bad practices? Bihar's weak enforcement of land reforms left over 70% of the scheduled castes, perpetuating systemic inequalities. The failure to implement land ceiling laws and redistribute surplus land to marginalized communities highlights the lack of political commitment and administrative perpetuating systemic inequalities. Land failure to implement land ceiling laws and redistribute surplus land to marginalized communities and highlights the lack of political commitment and administrative inefficiency. Marginalized communities continue to face structural barriers, including caste discrimination, which hinder their access to land. Addressing these issues require robust legal frameworks, better monitoring, and mechanisms to ensure accountability in land distribution process. In Jharkhand, corporate land acquisitions for mining projects have displaced large numbers of tribal communities, stripping them of their customary land rights. Displacement has led to economic destitution, loss of cultural identity, and increased marginalization of these communities. The lack of recognition for tribal land rights underpins these issues. While laws like PESA Act of 1996 and Forest Rights Act of 2006 exist, their weak enforcement has left many tribal communities vulnerable to displacement. These case studies underscore the importance of targeted, well implemented policies in addressing land inequalities. Odisha and West Bengal exemplify how inclusive reforms can empower marginalized groups and improve livelihoods. Conversely, Bihar and Jharkhand reveal the detrimental effects of weak enforcement and prioritizing industrial interests over equity. Strengthening institutional accountability, enhancing community participation, and integrating rights based frameworks are crucial to replicating success and mitigating failures. Let's understand the challenges and gaps. The lack of transparency in land records and ineffective enforcement of land reforms continue to hinder access to land for marginalized groups. These gaps allow powerful actors to exploit loopholes, perpetuating inequities in land access and control the distribution. There are social barriers like caste, gender, and tribal identities, which remain significant barriers to equitable land access too. Discrimination against scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and women limits their ability to secure ownership or legal rights, despite the existence of protective laws. There are economic pressures like rising land values and increasing privatization exacerbate disparities. Smallholders and landless face displacement as their land becomes a target for industrial and urban development, leaving them economically vulnerable. Environmental degradation is one of the major causes, and shrinking access to commons, grazing lands, and forests due to privatization and deforestation disrupts the livelihood of rural communities and contributes to environmental decline. The depletion of these shared resources disproportionately affects pastoralists, tribal groups, and small scale farmers. These challenges highlight the need for stronger policies, enforcement mechanisms, and social interventions to ensure equitable land distribution. Addressing these gaps require a focus on transparency, legal safeguards, and sustainable management of shared resources. So, what are the potential opportunities here? In the part of policy innovation, strengthening redistributive land reforms is critical to ensuring equitable access for women, scheduled caste, and scheduled tribes. Digitizing land records can improve transparency, reduce disputes, and enhance accountability in land management. We can go ahead with community empowerment as well. Promoting collective ownership models such as community land trusts can empower local communities to manage and benefit from land resources. Grassroots movement advocating for secure land rights play a vital role in amplifying the voices of marginalized groups and ensuring their inclusion in the decision making process. In the parts of ecological integration, policies that align with environmental conservation and equitable land access are essential. Sustainable land use strategies can ensure that marginalized communities benefit from resources while preserving ecosystem. Addressing inequities in land access requires a multifaceted approach combining policy reform, community participation, and ecological sensitivity. These efforts can foster inclusive development and social equity and environmental sustainability. We can conclude by understanding the access to land is a cornerstone for reducing poverty. Promoting social justice and achieving sustainable development, it provides livelihood, economic security, and social identity, making it essential for fostering equity and resilience in society. However, systemic barriers from policy inefficiencies to social discrimination perpetuate these disparities, particularly for the marginalized groups like women, scheduled castes, and scheduled tribes. Achieving equitable land access requires comprehensive reforms, grassroots empowerment, and ecological integration. Strengthening redistributive policies, digitizing land records, and promoting community led models can help bridge these gaps and ensure fair distribution and access of resources. Advocacy for these measures, coupled with active support for land rights movement, is crucial to dismantling entrenched inequalities and building a more inclusive society. Stakeholders, policymakers, and individuals must champion equitable land policies and support initiatives that empower marginalized groups. Together, these efforts can pave the way for a just, sustainable, and fairer future. Thank you for your time.